Good afternoon readers, it's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf and welcome to my first Victober video on my own channel. So I've been involved in some Victober videos with Roz at Scallydandling about the books. We've been talking about favourite Victorian poetry with Tennyson. We've been talking about a scandalous Victorian play in The Second Mrs. Tanqueray, and we have also been talking about 5 favourite Victorian novels that we have read recently. So you can go to Roz's channel to find all of those, which I'm sure you've been to already. And yeah, today we're going to be talking about Dickens. So it often happens, I think, in my life as a reader, that there is a weird connection between things that I read and things that happen in my real life, or between different books that I read that I didn't expect to have any connection between them. And this has happened for me this month because I was reading Face It by James Partridge. This is a non-fiction book. I would highly recommend it for Non-Fiction November. It came out in 2020. And Face It tells James Partridge's story of, it's a memoir, it's more or less a memoir slash slightly a self-help guide, talking about his experience of having severe burns, particularly to his face, the experience of then having a facial scarring resulting from that injury, how he went on to live a normal life that had no connection to his injuries, and then how he came to get involved in challenging facism, tackling facism, and being at the helm of a charity called Changing Faces. I will try to link to them down below. That is an organisation in the UK that works with people who've got distinctive faces for whichever reason, to try to give them the skills to manage in a unfortunately a facist society that makes certain judgments on the basis of people's faces, and then also to work on challenging ideas of facism. I wasn't expecting this to come up in my Victober reading, but for Victober I'd set myself the challenge of reading one big Victorian novel, and I had 2 novels in mind. It was either going to be Middlemarch or it was going to be Bleak House, and I have this idea that Middlemarch is a little bit of a challenging book, and Bleak House, although I'm picking up the wrong books now, although it's massive, it's comparatively easy because it's Dickens. He was a real popular writer, you know, he wrote to be read quite easily. So I decided to opt out of the challenging option and I went for Bleak House. And Bleak House has got such an important character in it that has experience of acquiring facial scars, facial difference, and it has a really interesting narrative of how that character progresses with that, and like the development through the novel, that I couldn't help but think about James Partridge's ideas about facial stigma, and how his story kind of reflects the story of the character in Bleak House. And then I got to thinking, and I realised that every Dickens book that I've read so far, which is only 4, I have read some short stories as well, but the 4, I'm working with 4 main novels here, all of them featured characters with facial scarring, and all of them sort of exhibit some of the examples of facial stigma that James Partridge talks about. So what I want to do is I want to explain the 3 main forms of facial stigma that James Partridge sort of defines in his book, and then I want to identify them in Dickens's novels, and then I want to talk about how James Partridge's experience reflects the experience of a character in Bleak House. I'm going to do my best to avoid spoilers for the other novels that I discuss. When it gets to a certain point, I am going to be talking very specifically about the story of a character called Esther. I went into Bleak House knowing a few of the people who died. I went in knowing some relationships between characters which are held as a great mystery, and I still absolutely loved it, so I don't think having spoilers would massively impact your experience of Bleak House. But if you don't want to know about that storyline, do please pause the video at the point when I start talking about Esther. So I think an important thing to note about James Partridge's experience is he had his burns quite a few decades ago. I think it was in the 1970s. I should probably have checked that. So his experience of it kind of goes through the late 20th century and into the 21st century, and he sees changes over that time. But obviously it is a very different context to Esther's experience, and in terms of his experience of medical care, that was a different experience to what you would get today if you had a facial injury today. And I'm going to be talking about some of the ways that that's different as we go along. But I think the fundamentals of facial stigma have been fairly consistent, at least since Dickens's time. Which is obviously a bad thing, just to be clear. It's something that Changing Faces, I think, is working on, but it's a very big thing to change. And part of that is because it is so ingrained in culture, literature, films, and so on, as evidenced by some of these books. So this video is my contribution to discussing the theme of facism. The other thing that I meant to say is the reason that I was reading James Partridge's book is because in my job at the moment, I quite often work with people with facial injuries in the acute phase. So I work with people who have just come into hospital with an injury that may or may not be to their face and that may or may not result in scarring, often at a phase when we don't really know what's going to happen. And the person involved doesn't have a clue what's going to happen. So although I'm not a scar specialist and I don't have a huge amount of knowledge about scars and scarring, I am often involved in talking to people about, you know, what they might be going to be expecting in the next sort of weeks to months with regard to how their face is going to look. So James obviously goes into a lot of detail about all of these topics, but I'm just going to give you the headlines, I suppose, because otherwise this video is going to be very, very long. I've only got 25 minutes of recording time, so there's a limit to how long we're going to get. So facial stigma number 1 is you are sad and second rate. Facial stigma number 2 is you are morally deficient. And facial stigma number 3 is why don't you fix it? So these are the 3 things that he faces as people's attitudes towards him, or that they have identified from studies as well. This is not just his opinion, and this is kind of like a more broadly examined area now. It wasn't so much when he faced it initially, but it has increasingly been studied thanks to Changing Faces and people who have been ambassadors for Changing Faces, such as James Partridge. But these are ways that people can respond to a face that is injured. And we're going to be looking at how they fit into Dickens's works. One thing that I find really interesting with Dickens, and obviously I haven't read that much of his work yet, but we do see a change in the way that he writes and the way that he handles challenging social themes from his early novels into his later novels. Even though in his private life he didn't exactly act as a moral paragon at all times, in his writing, it seems he becomes more progressive, and he becomes more appreciative of how his writing might impact on people. And for instance, I think Katie of Books and Things has talked about how his handling of Jewish characters goes from being very strongly discriminatory and anti-Semitic at the start to having Jewish characters portrayed as positive, or at the very least kind of complex and multidimensional towards the end of his writing career. And I think the same happens really with how he handles characters with facial difference, where he goes from a very stereotypical, simple approach to it to having this story in Bleak House, where it's a very kind of complex progress. So I'm gonna get into the actual text of it now. One of Dickens's first books, I think it was his second fully published book, was Oliver Twist. And Oliver Twist is known for having a bad character. And this is an evil character who has got a face that, the way the face is described, the face is supposed to reflect their character. And I use that phrase very cautiously. I suppose it's the notion that moral deficiency is ugly, metaphorically ugly, and that ugliness on the outside, using that as a bad word, I suppose, from how James Partridge handles it, you know, that it shouldn't be a word that we commonly use, but somebody who's morally ugly on the inside will be ugly physically on the outside, and that is the stigma, and that is the stereotype that Dickens plays into with this character. I'm going to read you the one of the sentences about this character's face that shows you the strength of that, I suppose. Unworthy son, coward, Liar, you who hold your counsels with thieves and murderers in dark rooms at night, you whose plots and wiles have hurled a violent death upon the head of one worth millions of such as you. You who from your cradle were gall and bitterness to your own father's heart, and in whom all evil passions, vice and profligacy festered, till they found a vent in a hideous disease which has made your face an index even to your mind. That's really strongly worded, and that's really very, very unpleasant and quite dark. But we get this idea with this character that they are so morally bad on the inside and morally bad inherently. This isn't about decisions that they've made. This is from the cradle. They are gall and bitterness, and they're so morally bad that it can't be contained inside them, and it explodes out. And the way it explodes out is in seizures. And this is another, I'm not going to go into it too much, but the way that Dickens handles characters with epilepsy or seizure-like diseases does improve in his later novels, and it becomes slightly more of a neutral feature. But these seizures results in him injuring his face, and that injury in his face is a sign of his moral deficiency inside, which is an integral part of him. You know, he had no control over that. He was evil from the start, and that evilness comes onto the outside. So we see that as facial stigma number 2, as James Partridge described it, that you are morally deficient stigma. That happens again in Great Expectations. We see more of this you are morally deficient stigma in relation to facial injury, but it's different, and it's interestingly different. I'm not going to tell you the names of the characters, but I'm just going to quote what one character says about his actions to another character. He says, "I smashed his face." And we know, as the reader, at this stage of Great Expectations, quite near the end, we know that smashing of his face resulted in a facial scar, and that has been one of the tells for this character throughout the novel. I should say another feature of Dickens's writing is that characters often appear in mysterious circumstances. They aren't always named, or they are often using names that aren't the right names, and we as the reader are supposed to kind of detect which character is in which scene, and if we see somebody popping up in different places, we have to kind of recognise them, and the facial scars are one way in which we are supposed to recognise these characters. So particularly in Oliver Twist and Great Expectations, we see these scarred characters cropping up without knowing who they are, and that their appearance is used to make them into threatening characters that we don't know whether or not we should see them as threats or not. It's part of that you are morally deficient stigma that having a character with scars is portrayed as something that the good characters are wary of or concerned of or anxious about, and it is portrayed that they are right to be wary and anxious around these characters, and that these characters are what their faces are said to suggest that they are. That their faces are truly revealing of their internal character, which is like it's the way that stigma is handled. Is Dickens confirms it, and he uses it in that way. The interesting difference between Oliver Twist and Great Expectations is that it's not a self-creating facial scar. It doesn't, you sort of bubble out from this evil within, but it is a result of another character's actions. And in the world of the book, there is, in the world of the characters' minds at least, there is a sort of justice to that, where we see his facial scar is almost like a just recompense for the crimes that this man has committed, and the crimes, the way that he's caused impacts on other characters' lives. So Dickens in a way uses the scar in a kind of like as a moral tool, where it is visited on him for the actions that he has taken. So I found that quite interesting. Obviously not something to agree with, but it's a distinction. And this is a character as well who isn't evil from the cradle. He is, you know, supposedly maybe a slightly better character who becomes corrupted and negative. Never portrayed as a good character, but not born evil, I suppose. And likewise, his scar comes to him in an external manner, I suppose. So these two are both early novels of Dickens's, and these two both feature... Hang on, is Great Expectations early? Wow, I can't remember, but I don't have time to check, so hang on. Okay, I paused the recording and I checked, and it turns out that Great Expectations is actually later than Bleak House, so that kind of spoils my narrative about Dickens's improving attitudes to facial scarring. Completely, that argument just shattered by the little fact of the date. However, it is a change in that it's a scar that is that he, I hesitate to use the word deserves, but that it is portrayed in the book that he deserves it. Just take that the way that I mean it. You know what I mean. So moving away from these two, there is one more, and it's one of Dickens's last novels, Our Mutual Friend. This also features a character with facial injury, but this is the first time in this video that we have seen a character who was from the good side. So Dickens is he's known for having characters who are on the good side and characters who are on the bad side, and some grey area characters in between. But he's got a kind of an obsession with the Victorian moral code. And one of the characters on the good side is injured quite late on in the book, and it mentions that he had fearful wounds upon him. Later it says that he has a wounded head, and then at the very end we get this. But he was daily growing stronger and better, and it was declared by the medical attendants that he might not be much disfigured by and by. So now we get into the other two aspects of facial stigma. This is not about moral deficiency anymore, because we're talking about the morally good characters. This is about you are sad and second rate, and this is about you should fix it. So the you are sad and second rate stigma form is demonstrated by the way that the characters talk about this character, and the way that the characters talk about, you know, how sad it is, and how awful it is, and he's, you know, positive things happen, but, you know, it's like, it could have been, you know, how tragic this event is. And, you know, that's not to draw away from the fact that having facial injury can be tragic and can be really difficult and can be an emotional thing to deal with, and we'll get into that a little bit more when we're talking about Bleak House. But the way that it is discussed as being something that is something sad, and also something that shouldn't really be talked about. Like, we'll keep it quiet because it's such a bad thing. And that also plays into that kind of stigma. And then the you should fix it stigma. This is crucial at the end of Our Mutual Friend and at the end of Bleak House. This idea that his medical attendants have said that he should be left without too much disfigurement. And the you should fix it stigma these days is about plastic surgery, and it's about cosmetics, and, you know, and being able to completely undo any injury, which is not possible. And that's one of the reasons that it can be a very harmful stigma, because it can push people to look for solutions that simply aren't available. The you should fix it stigma in Dickens is slightly different, because actually it's almost part of the religious arc of the book. These morally good characters have their scars improve more than the morally bad characters, because, you know, God is kind and God is good, and he looks down at them and he says, you're a good character, I'm going to make your face a bit better. That is my interpretation of how Dickens talks about these characters, not in the quotes that I provided, because it's, you know, it's a bit more of a longer chunk, but this character has been reborn by his accident, which brings him close to death, and he's shown himself to be a good man and to have, like, risen above some kind of petty aspects, and that means that he qualifies for being good enough to have his facial wounds nearly removed. Moving on finally now to Bleak House. This is like the cornerstone that brings it all together, and I've only left myself like a couple of minutes to talk about it, but we'll see how we go. I just wanted to draw some parallels between James Partridge's experience and Esther Summerson's experience. So if you don't want to hear about Esther's story, please feel free to stop the video now. So James talks about his experience of something that he calls his face day, and that is the day that he sees his face for the first time after his injury. And Esther has a very similar experience. So I'm going to read both to you now, and yeah, talk about it a little bit more. He says, my face day. The run-up to my seeing it seemed to drag on for ages. Throughout January and February, I had asked intermittently to see the damage, but was constantly and firmly rebuffed. Not quite yet. Better when you're better, whatever that meant. Skipping a little bit now. I could sense the kindness and protectiveness of everyone around me, but what were they shielding me from? It must be even worse than I could possibly imagine. Eventually, at 2:15 p.m, curious how I recall the precise time that day, I was handed an unremarkable thin rectangular object with a shiny surface. A mirror. The mirror. I had played this moment over and over in my mind, but now when it arrived, I waited for advice. But then I saw that none of those around my bed appeared to have done this either. They were all in the same uncharted territory, just as terrified. It was down to me. I very deliberately and slowly drew the mirror across it. From the left side. The better side? Yes. Across the bridge of my ruined nose. Oh God, to my right eye, 3/4 closed, jagged with scars and skin grafts, and then, oh dear God, to my gaping mouth and jaw. I gasped, but had no breath. And finally to my right ear, totally unrecognisable as an ear. And then the whole thing, it. My stomach churned and I felt faint. I looked at my mother, saw how worried she was. I lied. I thought it would be much worse, and then, not as bad as I'd feared. I was shattered, and yet even in those first tiny seconds, I knew instinctively that I had to take ownership of it for one simple, immediate reason, so as to manage the reactions that I saw in the shocked faces and minds of the people around the bed, people who cared so much for me. So I think if you, he is very, very graphic in his description of his face, and that's part of the point. This is his own story. He has to voice that the way that he experienced it. But he talks about wanting to manage the reactions of people around him, and he talks about it being down to him and needing to sort of take ownership of that process. So with those things in mind, let's hear about Esther as she recovers from an illness. So this illness, it's not entirely clear what it is. I am going to run out of time, which is really frustrating.